Good afternoon. So this is Father Foster, Western Civ Lecture number 2, Western Civ 1, Lecture number 2 for the 9th grade. So I mentioned late antiquity, one of the distinguishing features was the Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire. And the Germanic invasions were decisive. For most of the 300s, the emperors were able to hold them back. But in the late 360s and early 370s, suddenly a massive crisis erupted. You see, the Germans had originally been in what's now Ukraine, the country of Ukraine. That's where many of the Germanic tribes were. But they had slam into the back of them. I wish I had a world map I could show you, but if you look at a world map of Europe and Asia, you'll see where Ukraine is. Well, the great steppe of Eurasia, in what's now Russia, had a people there called the Mongols, and a people there called the Hun. And in this case, the Huns were the ones that caused the problem. The Huns were a fierce nomadic people from the steppe of Central Asia. The steppe is a broad grassland, kind of like our Great Plains, that forms South Central Asia, northwest of the Himalayan mountains. The Central Asian steppe had these nomadic tribesmen called the Huns, and then further back behind them the Mongols. We'll get to them later in our history. But the Huns are the ones causing the problems in the 300s AD. They were fierce, vicious people. I'm sure you've heard of Attila the Hun. Many Americans say Attila, though better scholarly practice is Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun was their great leader, and he started sweeping westward and driving the barbarian tribes that were out there away. And they were terrified of him. Just to give you a... well, I better not do it. He had some really fierce sayings, but they're downright frightening, so I'm not going to do that. But his horse cavalry slammed into these Germanic barbarians in what's now Ukraine, and they moved further west, fleeing the Hun. But when they did, they eventually got to the boundary of the Roman Empire. The Danube River formed much of the northeast boundary of the Roman Empire. There was the province of Dacia north of the Danube, but the rest of the empire was south of the Danube. And when the Germans got to the border of the Roman Empire, they didn't let them in. They had border controls there. They were, refugees fleeing the danger behind them. But the Romans had enough of their own troubles. They didn't want a bunch of foreigners coming in who already had troubles of their own. And so they closed the border to them. They didn't build a wall, but they had a big river that they refused to let them cross. So the Germans are trapped on the north side of the Danube, looking across at what they hope is freedom and safety on the Roman side of the Danube River. But they formed a bunch of refugee camps along the Danube. And in these camps, the people had inadequate supplies of food. And they began to starve in these refugee camps on the north side of the Danube when they arrived at the border of the Roman Empire. And Romans came across the border, came across the river, and sold them food. But they sold them food at exorbitant prices. Huge amounts spent on this food by these Germans. And eventually, they started taking children in exchange for food. Remember, slavery was normal in the Greco-Roman world. Slavery was perfectly normal. And so parents were left with the terrible choice to sell one of their children to slavery so that the rest of their children could live. A terrible decision. And many of these German families had to make that call. But things got to a real head when a trader showed up to sell them food in exchange for children, and it turned out the food he was selling to them was dog meat. So they were selling their children for dog meat. You can just imagine the anger in these German hearts when they found that's what it was going to take to stay alive. To eat dog, they'd have to sell their children. And a leader of the Germanic peoples, the Visigothic Germans, named Alaric, 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 convinced his brother chieftains among the Germans that they were going to die of starvation there on the north side of the Danube, so they might as well cross and try to fight their way to some stable place where they could convince the Romans, hopefully after they got into the empire, to let them stay. And so Alaric led a bunch of his warriors, Germanic warriors, across the Danube. To everyone's shock, I think especially to the Roman shock, the troops the Romans had on their side of the border were inadequate to stop this German onslaught. These Germans pouring across with absolutely nothing to lose fought fiercely. And the border troops the Romans had in the region were just not up to it. And in fact, the Germans won battle after battle against these inferior troops on the border. And they started pushing deeper and deeper inside the Roman Empire. Eventually, in one of the most climactic battles in the history of the ancient world, the Battle of Adrianople, so just write Adrian with an O-P-L-E on the end, Adrianople, A-D-R-I-A-N-O-P-L-E, Adrianople, in 378 AD, Alaric and his German warriors, and the number of Germans increased with every passing month as more and more people crossed the Danube after the Roman border guards had failed to stop them. More and more were pouring in and joining Alaric's army. So it was by then a pretty good-sized army of highly motivated warriors. The Roman emperor himself made his way out of Constantinople, today's Istanbul, Turkey. But the Roman emperor himself made his way out of Constantinople into what is now Bulgaria, and met the German host and tried to stop them militarily at the Battle of Adrianople. Instead, the Romans were beaten. They were beaten badly by the Germans. The emperor and his top generals were trapped inside a log cabin they were meeting in, and the Germans burned the house and killed them all. So the Roman emperor was killed in the fighting at the Battle of Adrianople, as well as several top Roman generals. Unmitigated disaster. But after that, the new Roman emperor in the East decided the best course of action was to get rid of these Germans by sending them west. You'll remember that the Roman Empire had been divided by Diocletian into its Western Latin-speaking half and its Greek-speaking Eastern half. Well, by this time, in the 370s AD, the empire has got two emperors again, a Western emperor and an Eastern emperor. They were brothers, actually, at this time. But one of them, the one in the East, says, I'm going to get rid of these Germans. I'll send them west to my little brother. Let him find a place for them to live. The Eastern emperor hoped that his brother would give Gaul, modern-day France, to these Germans so they'd have a place to live inside the Roman Empire, but not in his half, in the western half of the empire. So the Alaric and his German folks went across the Roman Empire to Gaul, to what's now France, all the way from Bulgaria. That's a long, long way if you look at a map. But they went. But when they got there, the Western Roman officials they didn't want them there either. And by the way, where was this land coming from? It's not like we have farms laying around to give away for free. People own these lands. Romans own these farms. We're supposed to take them away from their rightful legal owners and give them to German barbarians? Well, that seems to be what Alaric expected. And it wasn't a crazy thing for him to expect, because the Romans had by this time become quite accustomed to having allies. Socius is the Latin word for ally. Our word social, society comes from it. They were used to having non-Roman troops allied to the Roman army. And so they would not have been the first barbarians to become Roman allies. And it had already been done that they had been settled in small numbers inside the Roman Empire on farms as payment for their service as allies to help the Romans fight. So that's what Alaric thought he was getting. But he had an enormous German army, and it would have taken a good chunk of the province of Gaul to satisfy their needs for land. And the Romans there said, no way, we are not giving you our land. It's ours. And the Roman government couldn't possibly pay them for the land to give it to the Germans. So Alaric began raising heck in the west, attacking towns, burning them, looting them, taking belongings, to try to force the Romans to give him a permanent home, him and his people, a permanent home where they could really make a way as farmers. They wanted to settle down in the safety of the Roman Empire. But they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. Now, Alaric was on the scene a very long time. And finally, by 410 AD, he had decided he was going to take the fight to Rome itself. And the Visigothic army of Alaric attacked the city of Rome, 410 AD. This is one of those crucial dates in world history, 410 AD. And the city of Rome fell to barbarians for the first time in 800 years. Some rebellious Roman generals had used Roman army units to capture it a couple of times, but foreigners, aliens, non-Romans, had not captured the city of Rome since the 300s BC. So this was a very long time back that Rome had been inviolate. Its walls never scaled by aliens until 410 AD. The Visigoths came in. It wasn't a total burn to the ground sacking. They were there for valuables. They were there for gold and silver. They were there for food. They took the valuables, they took the food, and they left after a few days. But the effect on the Roman mind of this was like an atomic bomb. The idea that Rome could fall to barbarians. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And yet it had happened. Now, most Romans were Christians by now. The great theologian Augustine, St. Augustine, the Florida is named after, Augustine of Hippo would write an enormous book called The City of God on his reflections on what happened in 410 AD. But it just goes to show how far the empire had fallen. Its declining numbers in population had meant its army couldn't be replenished. Taxes had dropped because of the decline in farming and population. There just weren't enough men to defend the empire, enough weapons to do it right. They had become dependent on foreigners that they paid to beef up their armies. And when an even bigger foreign army had finally got inside the empire, they couldn't stop them. So the glory days of Rome were clearly past, especially in the West. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire will make a comeback. It'll become known as the Byzantine Empire to historians a bit later. But these were dark times. The early 400s AD were very dark times in the Roman world. We will talk about what happens in the 400s when things get much, much worse. The 400s AD and the Western Empire were the end. So when you hear about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, it's the 400s AD in the West that people mean by that. So that is the end of Lecture 2 for Western Civ 1. Thank you.